Hi Ace. Today we're looking at Unit 5, Part 1, and we're going to be focused on the production of meat today. So this picture just shows some of our different methods and different livestock that we use for our meat production. We have up here a very industrialized pork farm, a very industrialized chicken farm and cow farm, and then just a different take over here in the bottom left that shows more of a free-range grazing type of system, just so you can start to get a picture of how they might differ. Now, one thing to think about with eating is that there is a difference in energy, in land use, and water use when you compare meat and grain-based diets. So the thing that we have to always remember is that it takes land, water, and energy to feed our food. So always our meat products are going to be more energy, land, and water intensive than the grain products. So this diagram right here shows us our land use for beef and mutton, and you can see that this by far is the highest land use that we have because you need land to grow the food for them, followed by pork, produce, poultry, and eggs. So that goes down into our more agricultural area here with wheat, rice, and corn. Now, as far as our energy input, you can see where the different energy needs come from. The orange here is the production. The blue is the processing, which is not very different across the way, and then distribution as well. So our distribution is high here in the green because it's so tied to the climate, so it might have to be traveled far. Now this is how much water it takes to make different things. So a cup of coffee to grow those coffee beans is 35 gallons, or liters, excuse me. But then you take a look at the steak, and that's 7,000 liters of steak, or water for that steak. So just to start to get an idea of the differences in energy, land, and water-based. Now, free-range grazing is going to be where you have your animals grazing on open fields for their entire life. Now, one of the really sustainable things you can do about this is you can combine different species, and that might help to fertilize the ground. You might be able to have some symbiotic relationships. It's much less stressful on the animals. So free-range grazing is definitely a very sustainable and beneficial way for the animals to be raised. Now the benefits here is that we don't really need to use a lot of antibiotic use, because you would use antibiotics in these high density areas to help to prevent disease spread. But when you're free-range grazing, you're not so tightly packed in, so you don't need as much antibiotic use. You might be able to use the fertilizer or the waste they produce as a natural fertilizer. So you might not need to fertilize your land if you're growing any different types of crops or maybe an orchard there. It does tend to be healthier both for the animals and then therefore the humans, because the meat might have a different quality to it. It is much more sustainable, and there is less need to supply food because they're getting their food from their natural grazing habits. Now, free-range grazing, though, is not perfect. One of the key things about free-range grazing is that you do need a significant amount of land. If you take a look at two different farmers, you need 20 times more land to grow food that provides the same amount of calories as you do for agriculture. So free-range grazing does require a significant amount of land, and that means it's more expensive for the farmers, and that means that price gets passed on to you. There is going to be waste involved, and when you don't have a way to contain the waste, it could become part of runoff that will get into our waterways, which could lead to disease, but also eutrophication, which is that algae bloom that will lead to lower dissolved oxygen in the water. And if you don't have a control over the number of animals that you have on your property, they might overgraze. They might take too much of that vegetation. And if you overgraze your vegetation, that can damage your soils, because we've learned that the roots really do a good job of holding onto soils and prevent erosion. So this diagram, or this picture over here, shows two areas. The one on the left has been overgrazed, and the one on the right has not. So you can see the difference in very dry and arid soils there on the left, because they might have lost the vegetation that might hold on to that soils. So this area over here has gone through what we call desertification, or that land is no longer arable or farmable or able to support plant life because it's been overused by grazing animals, and also compounded by the problem that it could be in a very dry area. And the final problem that you might have with free-range grazing is because animals are free to walk back and forth over your soils. They might compact the soil because our livestock can be very, very heavy. So taking similar trails or paths might compact the soil and make it difficult for water to move through the soils. Now the alternative here is what we refer to as a CAFO. So this is more large-scale agriculture. So this is industrialized meat agriculture. The animals are confined to a building for most of their life. They're raised indoors, and they're raised in a high-density environment. Now what this means is you do have to use a lot of antibiotics on them to prevent disease from spreading, because disease is a density-dependent factor, so the more tightly you have them packed in, the more likely a disease is going to spread. Now, also, oftentimes what you do is because they don't have the ability to stretch their muscles and move around and develop muscles naturally, a lot of times companies might use hormones to encourage their muscle growth and encourage them to grow faster. And those will be passed on to humans when we eat the meat. Now, all of these animals packed into a tightly space are going to create a lot of waste. And so it is contained in what we refer to as a waste lagoon so that it might be able to be treated. But if there's high storms or a lot of rainfall, what might happen is that lagoon could overflow and all of this untreated waste could wash into streams and our soils, leading to a lot of bacteria in our waters and the potential for those nutrients that are found in the waste to exasperate algae growth, cause that eutrophication to occur. Now with this, it does require a tremendous amount of food to constantly feed these animals, water the animals, so we do have to bring in food, so the farmer has to pay for that, rather than letting it occur naturally in a free-range grazing situation. So our pros of the CAFOs are that it is a lot more of a high product, and so you do have a lot more profit. And what that means is that the costs less for the farmers, and then it also costs less for our consumers. Now, as we're seeing countries develop, what we're seeing is that more and more countries are eating a lot more meat. That does tend to correlate with a developing country. As they go through the process of economic development, they do tend to eat more meat. So the demand for meat is growing, and CAFOs allow us to meet that high demand. And meat is a good thing to eat. It does provide us proteins and vitamins, so there definitely are some pros of eating meat. Now the cons are that it does create a lot of waste. So when we grow our food and we concentrate these animals, it does create a lot of waste. And all that waste can overflow into streams and, like we said, lead to disease and eutrophication. Also, if you store it in the waste lagoons, and down here you can see the waste lagoons, these might contaminate groundwater if they're not lined properly. So these should be lined underground or underneath the pool itself with some type of a plastic liner to prevent anything from leaking into the soils. But just for perspective here, these are all buildings, and this could be a chicken farm or a hog farm, and so you would have animals all in these buildings, and their waste gets funneled to these giant lagoons, or these waste lagoons. Now another con is that it does take a lot of energy to grow and process and transport the food that you need to feed the animals. So that is always something that we take into consideration. Now another thing, this is particularly a problem with cows. Cows that we are keeping in large concentrations, they fart and burp a lot, and that those farts and those burps, they will create methane. And methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas that we are contributing to in a large way by raising these high concentration of cattle. So that is leading to climate change. And we are exposing ourselves to more antibiotics in humans by the meat we eat because we're treating our meat with antibiotics and hormones. But by no means do I think that we shouldn't eat meat as a species, because there definitely are benefits of eating meat. It is an incredible source of protein. It can be a very lean source of protein and very healthy. and it has a lot of nutrients. It's just trying to find a sustainable way of growing the food to meet the needs of our growing world population. So some of the more sustainable ways that we can do this is if you focus on local foods. If you focus on local foods, they tend to be a smaller system, so you might not have as high of a concentration, so you might not need as many hormones and antibiotics. They also would use less energy and transportation to getting it to you. And they're more likely to be free range if they're smaller farms. And it supports local jobs and economy, which is always a good thing in your community. Now, some of the choices that you might have to do this in a more sustainable way are choosing organic meats. And those will be meats that are certified not to have hormones or antibiotics and are often free range grazed. And so those would tend to be a healthier choice for you, but also often a more expensive choice. Now, another thing that you see a lot of is farm to table. Now, if you see a farm to table restaurant, what that means is that this is a restaurant that has a relationship with a local farm, either for agriculture or for meat, and they source their foods from there. So these types of restaurants might have very changing menus to go with the seasons. And you won't have a lot of transportation that's involved in getting the food to that restaurant, not a lot of time, so not a lot of preservatives. So they tend to be much more sustainable. And again, you're supporting your local farming by going with that farm to table restaurant. So there definitely are some sustainable ways to be able to balance a healthy diet with good, solid environmental choices.